Okay, we are recording.
Okay. Let's go ahead and get started then. And maybe we can start with a motion to approve the minutes from last meeting.
Mike, if you will, just do it in a second. I just need to read the protocol slides here.
Yep.
So,
Oh, yeah.
Heidi, if you'll post those slides and take, yeah.
I sure will. Hold on just a second. I need to turn off some videos here. Can you see the screen?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Okay.
There we go, Heidi. So we are pleased to start the meeting this evening, have all of our community members joining us as well. As folks probably know, we try to strike a balance between meaningful, transparent engagement and online security. And so we have the following rules for all of our, online meetings. This meeting has been called to conduct the business of the Environmental Advisory Board. Any activities that disrupt or otherwise interfere with the meeting are prohibited. The time for speaking or asking questions can be limited, as we all know, and it's primarily for the public comment section, which has a 3-minute limit. No person shall speak except when recognized by the person presiding, and no person shall speak longer for the time allotted. Each person will register to speak at the meeting using that person's real name. Any person believed to be using a pseudonym will not be permitted to speak at the meeting. If someone comes in with a telephone and there isn't a name associated with it, or there is, the host may ask for a full name before allowing the individual to speak. Next slide, Heidi, thanks. No video will be permitted for any of the participants except for the city officials and employees and the board members. All others will be participating by voice only. The person presiding at the meeting shall enforce these rules by muting anyone who violates the rules. If the chat function is enabled, it will only be used for communicating with the host, in this case, Heidi. It would only be used for issues related to technical issues in being able to listen to the meeting. And if attendee attempts to use the chat for any other reason, then the city reserves the right to disable that individual's access to chat. And finally, only the host and the individuals designated by the host will be permitted to share their screens during the meeting. All right, thanks, Mike.
Sure. Thank you, Brett. And so with that being said, I would make a motion to approve the minutes from last meeting. If anyone wants to second that.
I second.
Great. Thank you. And it looks like we can move on to public participation. Are we going to set a timer, Brett, for the public participation?
Yes, thank you. I've got that.
Okay.
Oh, great.
Should be hidden with them. Can't tell if they're in yet.
Yeah, I'm gonna unmute, ask Paul to unmute.
Okay. Paul, can you hear us now? Are you?
Yeah, I could hear you all along. You all sound good. So thanks for this opportunity to speak to you guys again. I just wanted to highlight what we've been finding out about the Excel ZRP, and I'm concerned about the intersection between the ZRP and the city's new climate goals. I don't see a viable path to 100% renewable electricity. And it's something that's very important to our climate goals. So we need to work on Excel if we can. And then we need to look at it within the city. How are we going to deal with this situation? So not here with any solutions tonight, unfortunately, but something we need to work on. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Anything else, or is that the summary of your comments tonight? That'll do it. Or...
That's all I have comments. I'm getting increasingly concerned about air quality as I hike up Bear Peak and look out to the east. Mm-hmm. It's pretty discouraging sometimes. But again, I don't have any solutions for that tonight.
Okay, well, we should have a brief air quality update on the air quality effort later in the meeting, so hopefully you can stick around to hear that. And
Yep.
then, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Brett, do you want to now admit, was Lynn still here and set a timer for that as well?
Yes, I think Lynn, I think Lynn probably has a desire to speak during public participation as well.
No, I'm guessing.
Heidi, can you unmute Lynn? Lynn, I think you're good to go.
I'm personally very offended that I can feel up. That I take that as a personal, very personal issue. I think that's really, I'm looking at your images. Why don't you cut off your own videos? That's really insulting to the public. Just saying. Now, with regards to the Nexus study for the past couple years of demoing houses in Boulder, it's now officially okay to demo a place for $1 a square foot, which is like giving a gift to the developer, giving a gift to the contractors in Boulder, and increasing the jobs housing imbalance, which increases our poor air quality. And what's EAB doing about it? What is EAB doing about that? It's a Tabor issue, can we charge a fee that's reasonable? What is the true reasonable cost of demolishing a perfectly good structure? You can insulate the outside. You can do all kinds of things. Alpine Balsam, that shell should not be taken down at the hospital. It should not. There are so many ways to repurpose that building all over the United States. People are repurposing hospitals all the time. This is not a progressive place at all. I don't understand it. How can you promote demoing in this town with the cost of housing here, with a rising land value that displaces people, that brings in more and more need for services for the elite that live here? And those services are driving up the air pollution and our carbon footprint every minute. What are you doing about it? Finally, it's been years and years and decades. $1 a square foot to demo something. There's no dialogue here. I get it. I get it. You've got only yourselves to blame. Shame on you. $1 a square foot to demo something in Boulder. That is so not okay. Do you know what that's doing to the contracting industry to refurbish pre-existing housing? Do you know what the embodied energy is? What the full life cycle analysis is of a structure in Boulder? Do you know what that does to property taxes? Do you know how that drives elders out of their homes and into the homelessness that is everyone's problem in Boulder, and the affordable housing issue, which is everyone's problem in Boulder? What are you doing about it?
That's
You're an
time, Lynn.
environmental advisory board, and you should be doing something about this.
That's time, Lynn.
Keelan. And so, is she out of time now, Brett? Is that?
Yeah.
I'm just curious, actually, who decides, how is that cost of demo set? Does anyone know how that's set or where that comes from? Just kind of curious to understand that. Maybe we can bring that back in the future and talk about it at some point. But
Jonathan, do you have a sense of that?
Sorry, fishing for my unmute button. Without getting into a long discussion, I think it might be something to schedule for a future EAB discussion in terms of the analysis that was done by the contractor, the Nexus study that Lynn is referring to. I think she draws some interesting parallels to some of the other problems and issues that we're facing. It's not as simple to say $1 a square foot. I think there's a lot more embedded in there. But again, I think Lynn does raise some interesting points. We've had some ongoing dialogue with her, and it might be worthwhile scheduling something with the board to discuss a little further.
awesome, great, I appreciate that. All right, so with that being said, we can move on to our, let me just move our agenda over so you can see it better. to our agenda items for this evening, the rest of them. So I think that's going to start with an update on the climate action plan is the first thing on the list. So I think we're going to turn it over to you, Jonathan, and go, right?
Yeah, I think I can kick this off, and then I think Brett has some slides. Let me just kind of tee this up at a very high level, and then introduce you to some of the other team that's here. Again, really nice to see you all, board members. I'm Jonathan Cohen. I'm the acting director of the Climate Initiatives Department with the City of Boulder. Obviously, you all know Brett very well, but also joining tonight is Yael Gashan. And I think that I saw Laurel here as well. Laurel Trimble, yep, she is here. So again, representatives from our department. So I hopefully you all had a chance to read the very brief memo that came out last week that accompanied the very dense memo that was sent to City Council. And let me just do a little bit of framing first, and then I'd like to turn it over to Brett to do a little bit of the higher level elements, and then we'll talk about some of the goals and targets. But generally speaking, we have been working over the past year plus to really outline the next evolution of our climate action work here in Boulder. As you know, I think Brett has talked to the board on numerous occasions about some of our important learnings, really how we are starting to transform some of our approach. What are the critical learnings, I think, from our work over many decades of doing this work? And, I guess I wanted to start by just offering some observations to the board as you think about your comments tonight and reflections on both the memo and the presentation that you'll see here shortly. There is, I think, a very quickly growing recognition that the work that takes place at the local level really does need to transform in a different way in terms of how we do our work, the role of local jurisdictions and cities, and not just in terms of doing more of what we've always been doing, but really thinking critically about the what we are doing and how we're going about that work. And again, I don't need to say a lot of what Brett will say to you here shortly, but I will admit that many jurisdictions across the country and globally, I think, are recognizing and coming to this place that our traditional approach of locally based climate action is not getting the job done. And so that really forces us to think about how do we build capacity for systemic and joined up thinking? How do we really reset our ambition around climate action? And then how do we focus on ensuring just transitions at the same time? And so these are big issues. And we, I think, have done, I'm very proud of the work that the department has done to really dive deep, both in terms of the content and where we think we need to go and how we need to accelerate that work, but really redefining our role, meaning local government within that context. In the memo, there was a great discussion about the spheres of influence, and this has shaped a lot of our current thinking as a department. Where can we actually have a strong influence? What are the things that we control at the local level and local government? What are the things that we can influence? And where are those areas that we have a strong interest and desire to participate in, but we just don't have the touch point to be able to do so? And so that's guided a lot of our work recently. And I think it's been very powerful to think about how that guides our work. Simultaneously, really thinking, I know Brett, again, I'm referring to Brett here a lot, but he's going to talk about some of the additional insights about what hasn't worked. But I want to talk about how we really are exploring new opportunities to partner more effectively. You probably saw, if you had a chance to dive into the memo, there was a lot of discussion around how we need to, again, build that capacity for systemic change and how we join up with other actors in this space, where we find non-traditional partnerships where we haven't previously. And some of that is starting to really coalesce with our partnerships, for example, with CU and our key institutional partners with Boulder Valley School District and the county, but more broadly with nonprofit organizations and some of the institutions and coalitions that we participate in. And all of that is starting to create a much different ecosystem around locally based climate action and the role that we play within that. So I'm starting to repeat myself. So that is a good cue for me to talk, to have Brett talk with you a little bit about some of our key learnings and insights that are illustrated in the memo. What I do want to say, though, we're happy to take any of the insight and any feedback that you have. I saw some questions that Marty had posed, which were really insightful. I appreciate those and like an opportunity to discuss those further. What we'd like to do is take any feedback that you have and present that verbally to council on Tuesday night. I think it's important that they hear any comments or feedback that you have. Rather than going through all of the parts and pieces of the memo and how we intend to walk through council with those items, we tried to zero in on some key items that were illustrated in the memo. First, how does the board really feel about this framing, this reframing and recalibration of our climate work as a department, as a city, and as a community? How do we reset that ambition? And then any particular insights or feedback that you have about the proposed goals and targets. They are quite aggressive. We recognize that, and we want to talk about why we believe these are the right goals and the right targets and metrics to really track our progress moving forward. I want to make a really important point here, which is there are multiple ways you can land on goals and targets. And I don't want to use the word agonized in a negative context, but as a department, we thought very hard about where we should be going and how do we track that progress. And when we start looking at something like a net zero target by 2035, that feels incredibly aggressive. Net positive by 2040. These are things that I just want to reflect. We don't know exactly how we're going to get there. But what we do know is that it is deeply rooted in the science and what the science is telling us and how it tells us we need to be at those places by date certain. So our intention is to set the metric, to set the bar, to establish the goal as a community and recognize that we play a role in achieving those. Meaning we know that globally that's where we need to get, and we're going to do our part in helping the global outcome in terms of reducing emissions. And this is a point we'll come back to on a number of occasions throughout the presentation. It's just a really critical point that we're really shifting an important kind of framing to say it's not just about Boulder hitting that goal. It's about how we facilitate the achievement of those goals. How do we partner outside of our boundaries? How do we work with other communities? Recognizing that the criticality of hitting those targets is not just one city, it's how the entire systems can be transformed, and our role fits within that. So again, that was just I think a little bit of high framing. I'd like to turn it over to Brett. I think he's got some slides that he'd like to show you at this point. Lauren, I just wanted to point out, is here. She is the mastermind behind a lot of the goals and targets. She can describe how they were created, how we intend to measure those. Yael is here because she is the mastermind behind a lot of the framing and the creation of the memo, and a great thought leader within our department. And so hopefully among the four of us, we can answer any questions that you might have. So with that, I'm sorry I went a little bit long. Brett, can I lob it over to you?
Sure. And just want to make sure everybody recognizes that Susan has just joined us from Greece. So Susan, welcome. I know you're not on camera probably because of limited internet. So, but thank you so much for making a huge effort to be a part of this meeting tonight. So thanks. So with that, I'm hopefully going to now share my screen. Can everybody see the screen now? Okay, fantastic. So in the way that it's supposed to work, you all are the first viewers of this presentation. It is a bit rough still in terms of some of its graphics and things. And this is the first time that we've actually run through it. So we hope that this is timely and comprehensible. So, and we love to get your feedback on that. So with that, this is really about a whole new way to approach climate action. Well, I should say it's about taking a way that was emerging in our work, but really bringing it center stage, which is a systems-based approach. And now we'll just have to make sure that this advances there. Okay, so I want to start though by talking about a little bit of our history in this. I mean, we are a community that has been a really early leader on a lot of levels in the environmental space. I mean, I think all of you are familiar with the fact that we were the first community in the country that actually imposed a tax on itself to buy open space, and we've been emulated for that. We were one of the first to set a kind of development line, the blue line that kept development from crawling up the mountainsides. We were one of the first to create a walking mall. We're also among the first to actually really pursue climate action. Of course, This led, as many of you know, to our work around trying to form a municipal utility, and all of the many times that we had to go back to our community and say, do you still want us to go forward? And our community would continually say, yes, please keep going. We started this journey actually in 2002 as one of the first communities, I think probably in the world, that formally adopted the Kyoto Protocol, which part of the reason we did that was because our own federal government did not do that. We then soon followed that with the passage of the cap tax. Again, one of the first times that, perhaps the first time, a community actually taxed itself in order to start funding its climate action work. And the legacy of our leadership is really based on our community saying this is important to us and we want to fund that. And I think it's because it's one of the reasons why we're widely looked to and admired, because we've had the capacity, unlike many other communities, to really work on that. So then, as of course, in 2010, we started to really dig into looking at forming a utility. We passed our essentially second generation climate action plan in 2016 and adopted the then IPCC goals of 80% emissions reduction by 2050. And then just before COVID, we were launching this next round of climate action planning that we called CMAP, the Climate Mobilization Action Plan. And that was where we got to before, of course, things changed pretty dramatically. So, but this, I think in a way, because of that early leadership, we've been among the first to come to grips with the fact that there are limits to the capacity of change that we can create as just a single local municipality or jurisdiction. So I wanted to kind of illustrate this in part. I mean, one of the limits that we've recognized is that while we once thought that, well, the beacons on the hill, the communities that are really leading will show everybody else that that's possible, and that they'll all then start to do it. So this was an analysis that was just released last year by a group called CityScale that looked at which cities across the country had actually adopted some form of climate action plan or even program. And what it showed was that only 8% of the communities across the country had actually adopted some form of climate action effort. And those were highly concentrated in 25% of the US counties and about 33% of those larger metropolitan areas. You can see the blue dots are the places that have some form of climate action effort. The red dots are those that don't. It's just a little closer look. So you just kind of get the sense of the expanse of the country, not to mention the population, that is not actively engaging in climate action right now. And so clearly, in part, our theory about spread has not been come to fruition. It's interesting to note that many of the communities that are not signing on are also in some of the most vulnerable areas in the country. So in some ways, again, it's not necessarily just an issue of information and awareness. There are other things going on, as I think we all now know. So that's one aspect. It's not spreading. Another question or another realization is that it's not necessarily having the impact even in the places that we're doing it. So this is an analysis that was just released maybe last week by a group of folks who've been in this space for a long time, who met for over a year to try to come up with a sense of an analysis of that situation. And I think this quote kind of says it all, that despite all of the efforts and the, I think, important recognition of cities as climate actors, the reality is even in those places where we are acting, we're not achieving the kind of rapid emissions reduction that we know is necessary. And so now it's important, I think, that in this context, we also kind of update where we are in the context of climate change. I think, the notion that there's a climate emergency, these are just a few of the images of just the last year or so that have been taking place around the country and around the world. But, last year, this was a shot from Death Valley, a record-breaking heat all over the place, 132 degrees in Death Valley that day. And this, I think we know, 9 of the hottest years have occurred in the last 10. We know that it's getting warmer. What I think we may not have been thinking about is what that's going to look like in the next couple of decades. It's now really clear that cities are going to have to prepare for conditions of heat that they've never experienced. So this is a quote that I think perhaps best sums up for me what we have to be thinking about, that roughly a third of the communities over 50,000 in size will be facing summers in which over 30 days will be over 100 and maybe over 105 degrees. Now, there's only 3 places in the country that have those kinds of experiences now. 2 of them are in California deserts and 1 is in an Arizona desert. We have not prepared. We are not prepared for this. We do not have the infrastructure that has not been built for this. So there's a lot that we have to do to get ready for what is now almost inevitably coming. And as we know, that's just one of the challenges. Last fall, we had fires right down to our doorstep. I wanted you to see this map, though, that's on the right. This actually came out of a National Academy of Sciences study that was done in 2012. It was an analysis of what the fire incidence would look like for every 1 degree increase C in temperature. And so this was done, and so as you might remember now, we are about 1.3 degrees warmer on average across the globe. And in our own area, about 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit warmer than we have been. So look at that map. The J corresponds to our geography. And what that says is for every 1%, 1 degree increase C of temperature, we can expect fire incidents to increase over 600%. So we just have to now start to come to grips with these are the realities we have to prepare for, even as we're working to do all we can to stabilize climate. And of course, we know the last few years have been absolutely record-breaking in terms of the number of disasters and the cost of those disasters. Unfortunately, the reality is also that we are not seeing the level of activity, not just locally, but globally, that's necessary. So this is the UN issues a new report every year on the gap between where our emissions are and where they need to be. And this is from the 2020 emissions report. It says basically we have a serious gap between where we need to be and keeping temperatures within the boundaries of what we think can maintain a livable planet in most places. So the point is, of course, that we need a different approach, that this is a time where we're really going to have to, you can see that we're not quite done with this presentation. We need a systems-oriented approach to this action. It's not going to be enough to do this kind of incrementalism, place-by-place thing. It has to be across the entire system. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. So this is really, this slide in a certain way encapsulates the insights that we had leading up to the publishing of our last plan, which is that we sort of boiled down all of the issues around climate into 3 fundamental causal factors. Energy systems, which of course was where we often started and still an extremely important part of the process. But then we started to recognize that the process of a material consumption is also an enormous creator of emissions, and that probably now represents almost at least 1/3 of emissions. And more recently, we've come to realize that ecosystems, how we manage land, actually generates a huge amount of emissions, not just in terms of what isn't taken out of the atmosphere by trees and other forms of living vegetation, but just literally is released from the soil and from living systems back into the atmosphere. Now, what I perhaps hadn't been thinking of as much about is what holds these systems in place. And so there are things that are behind those causal factors, and we would identify 4 of those. These are the things that sort of hold in place the way things are. So think about, for example, our fossil fuel energy system. The fact that people still use a lot of natural gas or a lot of petroleum is because it's cheap. It's a very inexpensive form of energy. Why is it cheap? Because there are all these mechanisms held in place by economies, that are held in place by policies, that are reinforced by norms that we have that keep that system functioning. And if we want to create a system in which switching to renewable energy is the cheap, easy, and most appealing option, we need to start to get at some of those underlying factors that hold those things in place. And so part of what we've been trying to do is actually think through what are those underlying sort of pillars that are holding this in place. So we've identified these 4. Now, if you add these 2 things together, the causal factors and the system drivers that surround them, you get this kind of a picture. And why is this important? It's because we can work on trying to change one of these factors like energy systems, but we have to be thinking about how we're then influencing policy, markets, the emergence of new technology and options, and then how our norms and culture hold that in place. Because as we know, and we are seeing vividly right now in our society, policy will change depending on culture and norms. And so, all of these things have to be considered and worked together. So what is the role of cities in all this? Well, in many ways, as Jonathan was pointing to, we can't affect or control all of these major factors, things like the configuration of the grid, the type of energy generation that's being used in all of the utilities right now. We are trying to influence that. We have made ourselves more influential in that, but there are things that we still don't really control. But there are ways that we can do innovation, we can do testing, we can do adoption pieces that when we partner, we can then start to use to influence those things. For example, in our own work, we were among the first to start experimenting with residential electrification. And through that innovation and testing, we identified a whole series of barriers and opportunities that resulted actually in the forming of a national organization, the Building Electrification Institute, and has influenced the way we've been trying to change policy at state and national levels to be able to enable that electrification to happen. Because we can't do that all by ourselves in our locale, but through our innovation, we can influence that happening. So those are all important aspects, but another set of insights that I think have emerged around what climate action needs to be and how we even think about what climate action is, has been, as we all know, the emergence of these really essential discussions about equity, social justice, climate justice, and how those need to be embedded in, that we need to center all of our work now in addressing those inequities which have been built in, that are structurally embedded in our systems that we have today. So equity now has to be a part of this. And climate action can no longer be simply focused on how we reduce emissions. We have to now start preparing for the climate change that is coming. And so climate action, we are suggesting now has to, when we say climate action, we need to be thinking about all three of these things: how we're going to reduce emissions, how we're going to prepare for the climate change that's coming, and how we're going to do all of that in an equitable way. So in terms of equity, I think it's worth going into this just a little bit further. What does that mean to have a system that's really centering equity? For one thing, it means that everybody gets to and should, and we have to make a distinct effort to make sure everybody's at the table as we start to think about what we're going to do and how. The second element of that is we need to make sure that the benefits and the costs of whatever we do are equitably distributed. And in some ways, that some elements of our system carry more of those burdens now because they've carried less in the past. That we actually have to figure out ways to fund this that actually correct some of those historical imbalances. And finally, we need to be thinking about how this is going to affect future generations. Just as a quick aside, I don't know how many of you have heard or have read yet The Ministry for the Future, but that's a very interesting book. It's a science fiction consideration of what the future might look like. And the title is based on an idea that eventually the UN forms an institution to start representing future generations in this discussion. Okay, so what does this all mean? Okay, it's very maybe interesting in the abstract, but what does it actually look like? So let's talk a little bit about this in the context of a number of places that we have been taking action and that we will take more action. One is in policy. So an obvious example of this, is in the Colorado Communities for Climate Action, something that Boulder and Boulder County together formed, what was it, Jonathan, 4 or 5 years ago, and which was initially just a handful of these cities and counties and is now, what is it, Jonathan, 34, 35 cities and counties around the country?
37 today.
37. And it has had a very significant influence in state level policy. So we knew that we couldn't change something by ourselves. We had to bring in and make the tent bigger, bring more people into that process. And you can see just a part of all the communities that are now taking part in it. So that's an example in policy. Let's talk about legal systems. Boulder and Boulder County, again, took the kind of audacious step of suing Exxon and Suncor. This was, I think we filed our lawsuit in 2018, and how prescient it now seems to be when just last week it was announced that 3 big oil companies faced legal and shareholder initiatives that have actually now started to have big impacts on their approach to business. In the context of circular economy, we are starting to map the material flows in our community. This is a Sankey diagram of the flow of materials into, through, and out of our community so that we can start to figure out how to close these loops and then starting to work at a broader level. Just today, I think we heard, Jonathan, wasn't it about a plastics initiative bill at the state level that we were very active in helping to move. What was that?
Yep, a plastic preemption. Yep. So we have a great new bill that we should actually do a legislative roundup with the board at some point too.
Yeah. So, and this is just the beginning of this work that we're starting to do around circular economy and thinking through the role of cities and local jurisdictions in that. Let's talk about energy, of course, one of our core areas of action. I know that many of you have various opinions about where we landed in terms of the city's work on municipalization, or at least landed currently, because we still have options for pursuing that in the future if we need to. But we have continued to try to push the envelope of utility innovation in this new episode in terms of how we partner with Xcel. So we've worked outside of that system. We've pushed it a long ways there. We're now trying it inside that system, working in a collaborative partnership with them. And we may choose another path, but that's a big part of what we are now working on. We're also continuing to lead in the issues of electrification and how we move that forward, both locally, but especially at the state level. And we're starting to explore new approaches to financing, like tariff-based financing, that starts to build in this cost of infrastructure transition into the rate base so that a single owner doesn't have to try to carry that burden by themselves. In ecosystems, I just call out a couple of things. The city, through I think a very unique relationship, has entered into a partnership with the Urban Sustainability Directors Network and jointly formed a new effort called the Urban Drawdown Initiative, which is taking the work we have been doing. We were among the first local jurisdictions to start to work on carbon drawdown in natural systems. We're now supporting that work in a lot of other communities around the country. We have just built a new tool that enables communities to start managing carbon into living systems in ways that create ecosystem services like more shade, more water infiltration for storm events, more nutrient dense food. That tool that we built with Trust for Public Land has just now been posted to the web, and we're building it for more cities soon. Simultaneously to that, Boulder has been a part of helping to launch a national initiative called Trees for Community Recovery, which is pushing for a massive amount of new funding for urban forests as a part of both of an economic recovery and a public health and climate action effort. So these are ways that we are doing things locally as we also start to push the opportunities out in other communities. On the new area of action, our community called out around economy and financial systems. We just launched, I don't know how many of you had a chance to attend last week, but we just launched a 6-month forum that started with Dr. Jeff Sachs last week from Columbia, talking about what is the role of the economy in driving climate change and how would we redirect and refocus the economy to actually stabilize climate, as well as a whole other set of issues like equity, biodiversity, toxics, et cetera. So with that, I'd like to now transition to the last part of the presentation into how do we actually measure progress around this? So, and what should our overarching goal be? So, and again, Lauren is with us tonight, one of the architects of this. I think, as Jonathan said at the outset, it's really important to underscore this. We have tried our very best to ground everything that we're doing in this category to the best available science that's out. So, as we all know, at least currently, the benchmark for this is that we are trying to hold global temperatures to no more than a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase. We are already at somewhere between 1.1 to 1.3 degrees. So we don't have very much time left to be able to actually keep that within that boundary, about 10 years, according to the IPCC. So 1.5 degrees there's a little bit of the IPCC says, okay, you've got till 2050 to get sort of to net zero if you want to have a 50% chance of maintaining that 1.5 degree measure. Well, we think we don't want a just 50% chance. We'd like a better chance, like a 66% chance. And they say, well, if you want to get there, then you really ought to be net zero by around 2035. So, and we also feel like because we are a part of the societies that have pumped most carbon into the atmosphere, we also have an obligation with also the resources that we have to be the part of trying to be the leaders in getting that down. So it's part of the reason why, while the larger goal, if we want to stay at a 50% chance of getting there, is 2050, we're suggesting a net zero goal by 2035 to give us that best chance. So part of our, again, our reasoning for why we think that Boulder should assume an even more ambitious goal than some others is because we've been a part of creating this problem and because we have more capacity to try to actually fix it. That line at the top is the average US per capita in carbon emissions. Those lines below represent the European Union in blue, China in orange, the larger world in brown, and India, in purple. So clearly we continue to be one of the most responsible agents for carbon emissions. So in terms of the stabilization targets, our prior goals were 15% emissions reduction by 2020, which we've hit against a 2005 baseline, a 50% emissions reduction by 2030, and then an 80% emissions reduction by 2050. That was our previous goal. Our new goal is a 70% emissions reduction by 2030 against a 2018 baseline, to become net zero by 2035 and to become net positive by 2040. So one of the things that Jonathan noted, I think this is, we can't stress this alone, is we are not saying that Boulder by its actions alone can set and achieve these goals. We are saying that these are the goals that we must set as a society, and that we as Boulder must do everything within our power to enable them to be achieved, but that we should not misunderstand that somehow we have the power and control to be able to set and achieve those kinds of goals by ourselves. That's a major difference, I think, between the way we previously talked about and thought about achieving these goals. So that's one aspect. The second of it is, again, it's not just about that emissions reduction. It also has to be about how we achieve resilience as these things are going to continue to change, and how we do that in the context of equity. And finally, we have to also acknowledge that the way we have measured emissions is actually incomplete. It hasn't really fully captured what are called scope 3, the consumption-based emissions, and it hasn't actually adequately understood the emissions that are being generated by ecosystems as well. So in terms of objectives and targets, I won't try to go into this too far. You've got it in the memo. There's actually much more detail in there. I'll just walk briefly through the 3 major focus areas that we've talked about most: ecosystems, energy systems, and circular economy. So these are the 5 sort of goals or major objectives for regenerative ecosystems: increase carbon sequestration, help advance the field of carbon management, foster resilience through the carbon that we're capturing and directing into living systems, design to maximize equitable benefits, and try to actually build sustainable economies around this. You can see a variety of those targets below. I'll just highlight a couple of these in the context of ecosystems. So 20% canopy goal for our forests. We're currently at maybe 13. We've been dropping, actually. When we measured it in 2013, we were at 16%. And then because of emerald ash borer and a bunch of other things, it's going to take a very significant effort to increase our urban canopy. Again, not simply because we want to capture the carbon, but because we need that shade for the heat that's coming. In fact, we will probably want to set a goal beyond 20%. 20% is a big stretch given where we are. But that's why we're launching a whole new initiative. And part of what I'm planning for the rest of this year is a new climate action initiative next year around urban forestry. So in energy systems, there's the 5 major objectives: safe, resilient, fossil fuel-free energy systems, equitable and affordable access, eliminating the carbon in our existing building stock, achieving net zero construction, and then, of course, achieving clean mobility. And again, we can talk about some of those targets beneath that. In circular economy, continuing, of course, to focus on minimizing waste per capita, really pushing to make products available for repair, reuse, and remanufacturing, creating a more circular economy and entrepreneurial opportunities around that. Building demolitions, I think part of the issues that Lynn was talking about, and reducing the carbon footprint of the production cycles of the products that we're using. So last slide here, next steps. This is, again, I think I mentioned this to some of you, this is just the first stop on a journey that you're going to have several stops on. So we're talking to council next week. We're going to go back to council in August with a resolution asking them to formally endorse the goals and targets that we've set forward. through the fall, we'll continue to refine this as a part of our strategy and resourcing plans. We'll come back to council in December with those for further discussion and approval. And then by next year, we're going to start to really move out into the community to talk about that larger vision. So with that, I think I'm done with the presentation.
Thanks,
And-
Brett. Does anyone else from the city staff have any more comments or info before I ask the board to start with any clarifying questions they might have? Nope. Okay, maybe we can go around. Miriam, you're closest to me in the picture, so do you have any questions you want to start with?
Yeah, I think I'll be most interested to hear how the city is planning to move towards that outreach portion of this and how, you know, in achieving the goals that you've set, I think an enormous factor in achieving those goals is getting the community to buy in and getting people to actually take action on an individual basis. And so how does the city plan to move that concept forward and get us all to do what we need to do as individuals?
Thanks, Miriam. Can't tell if anyone's trying to talk or not.
Do you want to just go around maybe and call on people, Mike, in this sequence?
Yeah, I just wasn't sure if anyone, Jonathan or Lauren, or you had any, or Yael had any additional info on that.
Well, I guess there's a question for protocol, Mike, for you. Do you want to try to address each of these questions in turn? Do you want to kind of go through some high-level framing discussion? What would be most beneficial to the board?
Maybe we'll go around and each throw out a question and then we'll take it from there. Just for the interest of time, we'll each put out one or two clarifying questions. So Hernan, do you want to throw one out next and then we can kind of take them in order? I think you muted.
Sorry. I have a lot of questions. I don't know how you would like to approach that. Like ask one now and then just shut up, or
Yeah, we'll do one. Is that good? Brett, does that work for you?
Yeah, I think maybe go around with one piece for a couple of rounds.
Okay, so first, just a small suggestion. I will add slide numbers to the slides at the bottom. So, because when I was taking notes or asking questions, I mean, now I don't know which slide it was. So, yeah, I will just add slide numbers at the bottom for easy reference. Okay, let's see. So, I guess this is a little cynical, but so it seems like in the past 2 decades, we've spent a lot of time and money as a city trying to implement a lot of goals, right? So it wasn't clear to me how we're any better or in a better position than, you know, any rural community in Eastern Colorado that hasn't spent any money.
Okay. And would you guys like to address that now, or do you want to just get a question from each person?
Why don't we go around one time, get all those questions, we'll answer those and then come back around again.
All right, Susan, I just saw you in here. Did you just disappear again, or are you still, you flashed on screen for a moment?
I'm here. I have limited bandwidth and I want to make sure you can hear me rather than see me.
Yep, clearly. Yep, go ahead.
Okay, cool. Besides, it's 3 a.m. here. You really don't want to see me right now anyway. So I'm having trouble framing my comments as questions. Maybe I'll just go ahead and express them as concerns. I would like to start by saying, I think that what city staff has done is amazing. That moving to a systems approach, I think, is more accurate in terms of how we need to address the situation. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, I had a big glitch. However, I'm concerned that we may be stretching too far to systems only and not also focusing on actions that we can take as a community. And the reason I'm concerned about that is I'm afraid that that will lead people to believe, oh, well, there's really nothing I can do. There's really nothing Boulder can do. We have to change things outside of us. And therefore, I'm gonna not do anything and wait for somebody else to fix this problem. So I think there needs to be a little more personal engagement. To that end, even in the beginning where we're talking about global impacts and the temperature in Death Valley, I would really personalize that in Boulder. People seem to have forgotten that we had 2.5 months of smoky days last summer. I'd like to see that translated into what the impact was on public health. I know that I had a cough for months after that, and I think lots of other people did too. So kind of personalizing those impacts. I know that many people know a friend of mine, Karen Condiff, this week, who lives on Left Hand Canyon, who was almost evacuated again because of the runoff coming down through Left Hand Canyon from the Calwood fire last year. Black water almost overflowing the banks. Those are the kinds of images that stick with people here locally, not just globally. And so I would really encourage us to start the presentations by localizing the effects of some of those impacts. Secondly, I would say that when it comes to system drivers, I'm concerned that we're underestimating the force of economy and markets, that in Boulder in particular, so much right now is being driven by development, by big economic concerns. And if you need any evidence for that, just take a look at CU South, which, by the way, if we were really going by the principles that you're suggesting in this climate action plan or the last one, we wouldn't even be considering the type of development we're looking at CU South right now. When you look, another example would be Jared Polis's energy policy versus his climate action policy, which is totally out of sync. A local example would be the Excel franchise and moving back towards that when we're taking advantage of all this new energy technology. Our development processes, things like Marble House, we wouldn't be doing if we were really serious about climate action. Alpine Balsam, we really need to implement the kinds of forward-thinking energy systems that have been proposed there. The Transit Village, if you look at our land planning here locally, that's like the opposite of tree canopy, development of a tree canopy. So in every case, I think it would be good to put Boulder on the charts, so to speak. You know, you had one chart that showed kind of globally where emissions were coming from. Colorado and Boulder need to be on that as well. And lastly, I'm concerned about Boulder's appetite, so to speak, to support this kind of initiative. And when I say Boulder, I'm referring to Boulder City Council, the Boulder citizens in general. You know, as I've been involved a little bit with talking to potential city council candidates, I'm actually very discouraged about their knowledge about climate action, their commitment to climate action. In fact, I left one group because they wanted to water down climate action and call it environmental stewardship, which I thought was a term that did not get across the urgency of the situation. So that's a lot to throw at you all at once, and none of them are questions, but those are my key inputs.
Thank you, Susan. All right, so you have all gone. Okay, so I'll go ahead and give I have a question myself, and then I'll maybe read one of Marty's into the record, if that's okay. So you showed that map of the 8% of cities that have entered into a climate action plan. And so I guess the thought that strikes me, I totally agree with this systematic change as the way to go. And I think it's a very smart thinking. But I guess when I see that map, I wonder, is the hope that this 8% of cities, even if the other municipalities aren't getting involved, can sort of link forces and drive systematic change, rather than if they actually do it in a concerted effort by working together and pushing for it, versus if they're all acting independently and hoping that people will just follow along? Is the hope now that 8% can change the system more broadly for the other 92%, so that they sort of fall into that new system? And do we think that's realistic? So that's my question. And then I'll read Marty's, which actually I think is also echoes one of the concern I had reading the plan, or not a concern, but I thought I had reading it. So Marty wrote, I have concern about how the plan's element number 5 concerning consumptive-based emissions may be perceived as an advocacy for, quote, lifestyle change. How will this challenge be communicated so as to draw attention to the need to encourage markets to make available more carbon neutral consumption choices, rather than endorsing outright consumption curtailment? And so that's a question for Marty. And so I think with that, you have a round from all of us.
Yes, thank you. I'm trying to think about how to best invite my colleagues into this conversation. So maybe John or Yael or Lauren, since you haven't had a chance to weigh in at all, are there any of those questions that you feel called to address before maybe Jonathan and I jump in? Or Jonathan, did you have an idea around?
Well, yeah, so maybe what we could do, it seems like there was a little bit of grouping there. I'd love to hear Lauren weigh in on the consumption-based inventory. It would be really great to hear your thoughts there. Maybe I'll just start and kick off with just a couple of responses and try not to capitalize on the time. I wanted to recognize Miriam's question about engagement, and then link that, I think, to some of the other comments. Susan, you made mention about the importance too about behavior change. So section E in the memo, which begins on 28, starts to outline and really does a high level overview of how we intend to really focus on the engagement and outreach around this issue. I want to say this about the way we have framed the systems approach. I often say that climate change is a wicked collective action problem. So we say that individual change can't fix the climate, but the climate can't be fixed without it. So we know that all of the systems level approach that we are focused on, whether it be government policies, institutional changes, we know they matter, but behavior norms matter too. So it's not a this or that, it's a this and all of the above. So we often refer to it as how individual behavior change rolls up into collective action, which then in turn changes the systems that we know need changing. So I want to just make sure that it's not an effort to go away from, and I think I hear Susan loud and clear that we need to make sure that it's represented, that individual actions do matter, and we need to be very explicit about that. So that's what I heard from your comment. I also wanted to just respond to the question about, which did not sound cynical, by the way, the question about why does it matter? What impact have we had when we spend these dollars? Look, and I think I might get this wrong. Lauren can correct me if I do. Since 2005, we've reduced emissions 21%. It's 21 or 23, 21, I think. That's extraordinary. But I would also recognize the benefits that come from those actions. It is not just about reducing metric tons of carbon, it's about the co-benefits. And that's what we are learning so much about, how we are thinking about livable communities, how we are thinking about our air pollution, which are big issues. And the interdependencies between all of those things are critically important. And so I would say that, yes, in large part, the big systems that drive emissions down in communities that have not adopted or are not engaging in climate action, they may be similar, but that's a good thing, because again, we are trying to deal with a global issue that really compounds a lot of social issues. So we have a lot of benefit that we can point to in our literature, in our reports about our climate action plan funding, that we have invested wisely. And those investments have in fact created incredible benefit for our community. We can talk about that more, but I want to kind of just kind of keep rolling a little bit. The other thing I wanted to just reflect on, Susan, you had a lot there, and I wrote down a lot of notes, and I don't want to get too deep into it, but I I really wanted to appreciate your comments around really, I guess, what you were saying, kind of the economy and society, and how we really need to redefine and focus in on some of the broader implications with respect to economics. And that, I don't know if you were on when Brett was reporting around our first forum last week on the economy, climate, and community, because it's a systems area that we are starting to understand more deeply and recognizing where we can actually influence some of those key drivers. It's a tricky one and it's a very tough one, but we're willing to have those conversations. And the last thing I will say is I get it. I understand the comments that you make about CU South and Alpine Balsam and otherwise. And one of the benefits that I think, or I guess maybe one of the areas of progress that we have been able to make as a department, is opening some doors with other key departments within the city. It's not always cut and dry. Yes, if we were only looking through the lens of climate, we certainly would make choices differently around some of our land use policies, around some of the projects that are really driven by other motivators. At least now we are starting to have influence. We are having a seat at the table. We are engaged in dialogue with our peers across the city, and that's a positive. We're not always going to get it right. We just aren't. These are very tricky and they're very codependent and intertwined issues. And I am only responding to that issue so you know I absolutely hear what you are saying, and it is a very important issue for our department, and we're seeking ways to really address that issue as we move forward. So let me just stop there and maybe turn it to Yael, Brett, and either of you have any comments. And then Lauren, maybe, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you have any thoughts about Marty's question about the consumption-based inventory and maybe the city's role in that, I'd love to hear those.
Yeah, I mean, I can dive in with that right now if that's okay. So what I would say is, in terms of the consumption-based inventory, I feel like it kind of addresses 2 points that were raised. One was that by focusing so much on systems, we almost lose the individual action. And I think that by doing a consumption-based inventory, we're able to measure the impact that individual decision-making and choices have in terms of their total emissions footprint. So I think it should be able to provide some good avenues to kind of give more information to our community about actions that they can take at a more personal, individual level to create that kind of impact, in addition to doing the working on systems level change. And in terms of not putting too much focus on the individual and kind of leaving out the kind of bigger organizations that have impact as well, I think by doing a consumption-based inventory, we'll be able to really hone in on a lot of the material flows that have that really high carbon intensity that are coming into our community. So we'd be able to focus in on things like cement coming into our community, like building materials, and be able to really understand those material flows and their impact. And by doing so, be able to create more like working groups with contractors and other cities and try to understand what type of alternative purchasing options there are if we were to band together or things of that nature. So I think that doing a consumption-based inventory wouldn't only put the onus on the individual, but it would also give individuals more insights into what kind of things, kind of like we were talking about with the zones of influence. It's like there could be areas that individuals could have influence over, but it could speak to kind of areas where maybe they can't influence that consumption chain itself, but maybe we could work with businesses and other industries to hone in on those ones that have the high carbon intensity as well. So I see it as having the potential to address kind of both of those, and also still kind of give us the ability to really hone in on that systems level change into the future.
Yeah, is there anything?
Can I make a comment on that, Mike? It's Susan.
Yeah, totally. Sorry, my daughter just barged in. Go ahead.
So I love the whole idea of adding a consumption-based inventory, but I want to use it as an example of how the business community could potentially freak out at this. So, for instance, if you start telling our development community that we're going to begin requiring them to change their building materials, which, by the way, I personally am all for, but that is going to create incredible pushback to this plan. It's having a dichotomy between systemic change and personal behavioral change misses something in the middle, which is economy and market driven change. And that's, I want us to put together a plan that's really, that people are really going to get behind, that economy and markets are going to get behind in Boulder. And I'm just using that particular one in context of development and building, which is having a huge impact, the way we do that in Boulder on our climate initiatives. It's not something that necessarily individuals make a decision about. We can locally make those changes, but we can't be naive about the fact that there's going to be a ton of pushback in that regard. I'm sorry, I'm not feeling very articulate tonight, but.
Well, let me pick up on to try to use a specific example to talk about this a little bit, maybe to get at Hernan's question, which I think is a really important one. Like, what's in it for us? Like, why would we do this? Why, of course, we haven't spent all that money because we didn't get anything out of it. And in the context of the last, I'd say almost 20 years of this work, the thing that people have talked about, the way we've framed the issues, were in such abstractions. We talked about greenhouse gases ad nauseum in ways that, like, most people don't care about. You can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't touch it. It has no effect on you that you can apprehend. So I think we have to completely rethink, as Jonathan was saying, how we talk about this in the context of benefits. And so let's just take electrification as a good example. So if we actually were to try to electrify all the houses in Boulder and put that cost on the owners of all those buildings, just in the residential context, that's probably, it's getting close to $1 billion worth of investment. Most people are not going to do that by themselves. Like, it's just, there's all the costs of panel upgrades and all that stuff. But if we actually approach the utility through the Public Utilities Commission and say, it's in your absolute best interest, it's going to grow your rate base to have all these homes electrified. And we're going to make it so that you will do that, Xcel, through the rate base, and you'll spread that cost out for decades for each of those buildings. It'll be a tariff base, or it'll be some base, so that I won't pay that whole thing myself as the current owner. It'll be paid over 20 or 30 years. Then suddenly that becomes possible. Now I can get a heat pump that will enable me to have clean air in my house when those bad air events start to happen. That I will be able to stay cool in my house when it's really sweltering hot, yet terrible air quality out there. Those are the kinds of local benefits we need, especially the people who are in the lowest incomes and most vulnerable in our community. And that's the kind of benefit we could deliver through that thing that actually gets us off natural gas as well. So I think that we need to flip these things around, build them based on local benefits, and then figure out how we intersect that with the climate objective.
Thanks, Brad. That was a great
Okay, I hate to be the cynic tonight, but an even easier route to that, for instance, for Xcel to build their market base, is the transition to electric vehicles.
Mhm.
And I don't see them offering any kind of incentive for people to drive electric vehicles. So it's,
They
that
are
systemic
actually,
change is
Susan.
gonna take a
Susan, that is
while.
coming into play. Xcel is starting to incentivize electric vehicle development.
How?
I'm sorry, I was on a Clean Cars call recently, and there has been some talk among that community, and they indicated that Xcel has at least put forward the fact that they're going to contribute to charging stations and development at some point.
Yeah, Susan,
I see them contributing to charging stations, but I don't see them, any discussion of them actually doing incentives like the federal or the state level incentives for people driving electric vehicles. And, I want to make mention, for instance, in my neighborhood in Wonderland Hills, there's an 11,000 square foot house under construction with no solar panels. That's the reality of the community we're living in right now. That's the reality of the kind of economic drivers that we have. And it's not just systemic change. It's not just behavioral change. It's local Boulder policy change as well that we really, that need to be built into this plan.
Thanks, Susan. Brett, did you have something you wanted to say? Or,
No, I think Yael wants to
Did you?
Yeah, I just want to chime in. This is a great conversation, and I think my colleagues have made some good points to the really thoughtful questions and comments that have been made. And I just wanted to offer that I think, what we're trying to say through this memo and through this message is that that we really are rethinking the way climate action has been happening. And it's not something that's going to happen overnight, right? There's all these really big challenges that we've been facing, and we have some new insights about them. But one of the key things here is really rethinking how cities look at climate action. And nobody has the answer to that yet. So that conversation is happening at the national level. Brett has been initiating that with our colleagues at the USDN. And we're trying to figure this out. But I think one of the biggest insights that to me that has happened is this sort of spheres of influence piece, which is, what are the levers that we as a city can pull, and how should we pull those, right? We can't affect the global markets, obviously, from a city level, but there are some local levers that we can pull, and there are also some things at the state level that we can impact. And I think part of what we're trying to do through these coming months as we move into our new strategic direction is, what is the best and most efficient role for us as a city to impact this? And so we're not standing here saying we have the answer to that, but I think all of this conversation is making me think that's what we're trying to solution here right now, is how can we be most efficient to do what we can. And we can't commit as a city to saying that we're going to meet this overarching goal for the community and for the state, but there are things that we can do. And so let's really hone in and focus on that. And that's just going to be a conversation with you all, with our policymakers, and with the community on how we can best pull those levers and initiate with other actors and collaborators. So I just kind of wanted to share that perspective.
Thanks, Al.
Maybe Mike.
And I'm just saying, there are levers that we can pull around the city, but there are levers we can pull within the city as well. For instance, I see I don't think I see any mention of cooperation with CU, which is a huge influencing economic and institutional influence in our city. And if we were really taking resiliency and climate action into account in the plans for development at CU South, there's no way we would be approaching it the way we're approaching it right now. We would be looking at what the future floodplains are going to look like in a world of climate change, not what they've looked like in the past. We would be planning for an acceleration of huge climate events, not hoping that they wouldn't happen. So I guess my bottom line is that in addition to expanding to systemic change, we also need to be thinking about local policy changes that are important for climate action. We can't just skip over them. And it's not just individual behavioral changes.
Mike, I was wondering if
I
you
wonder
wanted
if we should do another round of questions. Go ahead, Miriam, do you want to go ahead and start?
I don't really have anything pressing. I mean, basically, I'm looking at how you guys are trying to account for, how you're going to track this, how you're going to make sure that you're meeting your goals, and you're talking about the consumption-based emissions. And I should read that study that you've cited about how it could potentially double the impact that we're having. But I mean, how do you create a tracking basis that is consistent with how the rest of the world is tracking these emissions, and then will it be comparable to other tracking mechanisms that are used throughout the state, in other cities locally? I mean, how do we make this so that it's something that's comparable, really?
Thanks, Miriam. Hernan, do you have another question you'd like to throw out?
Yeah. So I guess going back to if you could explain more how that tariff-based approach with Excel will work. I don't really get it. So what will be different for them? Because that's the part I don't understand, because you said, it will be beneficial to them to have a grid, I guess, of an electrical grid in every single house. But the part I don't understand if it's beneficial to them, what's stopping them from doing them now? Is it like, you know, some law, some initial investment? And basically, are you gonna like kind of try to convince them it's in their best interest to do that? Or are you gonna try to force them through legal procedures? And if so, is there any legal precedent for doing something like that?
Great, thanks, Hernan. And I'll skip my question. I do have one quick comment I'd like to make before we wrap up this section, but I'll read another one of Marty's, which I think we sort of touched on and Susan touched on a bit, which is given the possibility that Governor Polis may veto the state's proposed climate action plan, it seems important that the city plan not be lumped in with some of the political challenges confronting the state's wide-ranging bill, but instead be seen as offering constructive actions. How will the city engage with Governor Polis and his Colorado Energy Office to gain state support for the new Systems Boulder initiatives, or at least gain affirmation the Boulder plans for action are a right approach? And so that's from Marty. And so I'll go ahead and throw that out. And I guess the one quick comment I'll make, just I was thinking on that figure you have on page 19 in the sphere of influence map, we've heard a lot of questions about sort of the individual and are we giving them up? So I'm wondering if there's some way to take this figure and add another layer of drilling down to show individual actions. So it's almost from the individual all the way up to the municipality and then the sphere of interest. And I'll just throw that out there. You don't need to address it or say if it's a dumb idea or not, but toss it out there. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
So, and were you tossing maybe, Susan, did you have anything else?
Yep. You got any more questions?
I'm searching for it in the document and can't find it right now, but I just wanted to comment. In the document at one point, it talks about the racial inequities and redlining and those types of things that have contributed to climate change. And I think it is important in that section, I wish I could find it right now, to also indicate the economic drivers and the development drivers that have contributed to that, number one. Number two, I wanted to applaud you on the tree canopy goals. I think that's super important. And that's a good example of how are we then going to work with land planning and our comprehensive plan to make that happen. Because those, from what I can see in the planning board meetings that I've been attending, those kinds of things don't even get considered. So that's all I have to say.
Thanks.
Maybe I'll start off the responses in this round by taking the last one first. So Susan, yeah, thank you. And thanks for your leadership around this ecosystem issue. So I've been thinking a lot about the way we might launch a sort of urban forestry climate action initiative, similar in a way to how we thought about energy efficiency maybe in 2008, 9, 10, when we were just launching that, where we have to first really build awareness and understanding within the community about the importance, because a lot of people don't really recognize the value of trees for a whole bunch of different reasons. And then work through a voluntary process, which ultimately then moves towards some kind of policy like code and ordinance piece. And just as you're saying, like we have a major review of the Boulder Valley Comp Plan coming up in 2025. And that's going to be a very important moment to be thinking about a lot of things around land use, around a whole bunch of these types of places that policy could be driving this. So just to speak specifically to this, I think the idea is to start a campaign probably next spring that will be very much a kind of climate action through community forestry piece that starts to build an awareness and engagement around that, and then helps to build the community support for what could then be policy actions in that area. I think, by the way, the equity piece that you were looking for is probably in Appendix C, where they talked about the equity elements. And Mike, I don't think that your idea about a sphere of influence on the individual level is dumb at all. In fact, in the memo, there's also there's a table in one of the appendix, I think, that looks at that personal versus academic versus nonprofit. So it tries to take you through that kind of individual realms of influence.
Yeah, I remember seeing that. And I just wonder if it would be nice to have it all in one big sort of
Yeah.
image.
Yeah. And then finally, just to try to Hernan's point. So tariff-based financing is a little bit complicated to try to talk through it entirely, but basically it would enable the utility to take an expenditure, like let's just say in my house, 1961 tract house here in Boulder, it has a 100 amp panel. That panel is in no way actually suitable to have a house that's running all electric. I have to do that upgrade. I have to probably get a higher capacity service line before I even then add the different delivery lines in the house. And then I go through adding all those appliances. If I could finance that amount of that whole job and then put that financial obligation as an obligation of the property, not an obligation of mine, that will be paid off on my utility bill, not in 5 years, not in 10 years, but maybe in 20 years, then the cost of that payment becomes small enough that the energy savings that I'm getting from that will hopefully actually cover that cost. And then it's also shared across the multiple owners who will benefit from that infrastructure upgrade, which could last for decades and decades. So that's in concept how a tariff-based financing would work. And what for the utility, that means they're actually getting a customer who's going to buy more electricity from them over time because they have that capacity to use that. So that's the way then we can get these kinds of electric capabilities that allow us to use high efficiency heat pumps that are much better for heating and cooling and better air quality and so on and so forth.
And so the debt wouldn't travel with you if you were to sell the house.
That's right. If I sell the house, it's that little increment of payment that keeps being paid on each utility bill that all the subsequent owners will join in. And if you think about it, like we built these houses with one sort of infrastructure in mind. And now we want a sort of new infrastructure across that we need to be in place for 50 to 60, 100 years. So it makes sense to actually spread that out and to share that cost for all the subsequent owners who are going to benefit from that. And that's what tariff-based financing enables.
I just want to add quickly to that, because to Hernan's question, I think, it's a good point. It's not currently in the business model of the investor-owned utility to do something like that and at that scale. The scale that like large capital projects for generation are more aligned with how that business model currently runs. And so it is something we would have to try to pull some regulatory strings or through our partnership perhaps, or some other mechanism where we would try to encourage that and try to, obviously make it beneficial for the utility too, so that there is a rate of return on that investment and there's economies of scale for them if it gets big enough. But to get to that future of systems change towards electrification, it would take something like that to make it happen at that scale. And so it's not currently being done for a number of reasons, but it's an idea that is out there as like, hey, it could look like this if we really want to get to that scale to get all the homes and buildings that we need to up to the capacity they need for electrification.
And just as an example, by the way, Hernan, for that very important question you asked at the outset. So imagine this, that there's 40,000 single family houses in Boulder. Probably 30,000 of them really need this kind of, even just initially that panel upgrade to be able to be all electric. If you actually made that whole mechanism happen, like if you compelled or through whatever mechanism got the utility to do that, and they were now directing that to happen, that would create, imagine that being done across their entire service territory. That would create thousands of living wage jobs doing that work, which is an immediate community benefit that's really different than just saying, do this because it's going to benefit the climate out there somewhere. This is actually going to benefit our community immediately and directly. Jonathan, did you want to respond to the question about Polis, and then Lauren, you wanted to pick up the one about consumption-based accounting?
Yeah, I do. And just one bit of color to this topic that we're on right now. The idea of developing tariff-based on-bill financing is something that is specifically called out in our partnership with Xcel. We are working on the architecture, the idea of a utility covering the cost of energy upgrades and then customers paying the utility back through a charge on them with the utility bill is not that terribly unique. The reason that there is a barrier and reluctance is that utilities don't necessarily want to be a bank. That said, this is an ongoing conversation right now, today, at the Public Utilities Commission. Xcel is willing to pilot. They're looking at some options with Boulder to try to pilot some innovative financing opportunities that would take the place of what we put in place years and years ago, which is the property assessed clean energy financing opportunity, which ties the upgrades to your mortgage. This is just another tool to kind of address that high upfront barrier that homeowners have to implement some of these strategies. So I just want to talk very, very briefly. I know we're spending a lot of time tonight, but I just want to clarify one important point in Marty's question when he talked about vetoing the proposed climate action plan. It's important to be clear about what SB 200 is and why it was introduced. Fundamentally, it was really developed after a couple of years of frustration of lack of action, perceived lack of action by AQCC to enforce the emission goals that were outlined in 1261. You may recall that 1261 is really the climate action plan to reduce pollution bill that was passed in 2019. That sets out the state's overall objectives to reduce emissions. I won't go through the numeric targets, but that really is our climate action plan as a state. You might also remember that earlier this year, the governor's office released the Greenhouse Gas Pollution Reduction Roadmap, roadmap for short. And in that roadmap, it really outlined the fact that Colorado is likely to fall short of our goals. In fact, we're likely less than half of the emission reductions outlined in 1261. That really prompted this bill and its sponsors to really reference the fact that the AQCC already has the power to make the rules and regulations to help Colorado meet the goals. So it does a few things. The bill gives AQCC and CDPHE more funding. And one of the ways it does that is by closing a loophole in the AQCC regulations. And this is something, Miriam, you probably know a lot about, where certain businesses and certain functions that emit types of pollution like small particulate matter are essentially required to pay a fee. Unfortunately, it's exempted greenhouse gas emissions like carbon dioxide and methane. And so one of the things this bill does is includes that as a revenue source, which is incredibly powerful. Then there is the other issue that has been argued about setting specific sector-based emission limits. And that is something that the AQCC already has the power to do under 1261. And I can cite the actual portion of the bill if it's useful. The argument that, and I don't need to get into all the details here, the administration has arguments that they believe are sound. Getting to the question specifically, I think our plan and what we are trying to do is very complementary to ultimately where the state ends up, whether or not this bill gets vetoed or not. We still have a climate action plan that's very aggressive. It sets very specific targets that are I think, again, very complementary to where we are going. And the state recognizes the importance of collaboration at different levels of government, how the state relies on locals and vice versa. And then there is the role of the federal government there too. So through 1261 and the ancillary bills that were created, there is a whole network of communications that is starting to show up in terms of how local jurisdictions can and benefit from the state's actions and vice versa. Much stronger collaboration. That's going to continue regardless of what happens with SB 200. I have my own personal feelings. I won't go into those, but I think it's important to know what that bill does and doesn't do. And I don't think it's an issue necessarily for how we intend to go forward at the local level.
That was really helpful and clarifying. Thank you, Sean.
Mike, just a note, also we're at 7:30, which we don't really have any other major topics, but just wanted to note the time.
Yeah, I think we have just the quick plague rate management update, which will take just a second, and update on air quality. So I don't know if we want to spend a few more minutes here, Brett, or how you.
Yeah, there's two other quick things to maybe, in fact, let me just do those really quickly now. So Susan, since you're on the phone, we did invite the Rights of Nature folks to come and make a presentation in July. So that's on the books. And then Jonathan, there was a question for you. Let's see about, we talked with the EAB about their interests around resilience, and they're interested in knowing more about the work the county is doing, that we're doing with the county around the resilience piece with Paul. I wonder if you could just do a quick update with that, and whether there's some way that we could give the board more of a briefing around that work.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And again, I'm trying to fill up your future agendas here because I think it would be really great to do a more thorough briefing. And Lauren, who is here, also has been part of this effort. So this is a collaborative effort that you're referring to called the Localized Climate Mapping and Equity Initiative. It was really forged out of a partnership between Boulder County and the city of Longmont. And the intention is to really start to identify and bring the issues of climate change to a level where neighborhoods and households can both understand the specific risks and initiate actions that can reduce those risks to projected impacts. And so the intention of pulling in Resilient Analytics and our colleague Paul Shanowski is to bring his expertise in actually mapping the existing physical vulnerabilities and then being able to identify adaptive capacity risks down to the census tract, and then look at some of the localization of impact projections moving forward, look at localized stabilization strategies and adaptation prioritization at that scale. And it really nests very nicely with the work that the city of Longmont had a grant to start looking at, mapping some of the existing social vulnerabilities and overlaying that with the physical mapping system to start understanding the interplay between the two. It's really going to be, I think, in my mind, a really powerful tool for policy developers, for the commissioners and city council members as we start to think about the next phase of the effort. It will be an important tool for the residents. And I'm again invoking the work that Miriam has brought forward in terms of thinking about the air quality issue, being able to understand those impacts and be able to target residents and give them information in real time that's useful and powerful, and not creating new inequities where people don't know how you can give them information and they don't have the wherewithal or capacity to do anything about it. So it really helps us work with partner organizations, particularly in the equity space and the resilience space, having this tool. And what I'd like to suggest is to bring Paul back. We're getting close to having a running model of the tool to be able to show it to you and then allow you to ask questions about its usability and its functionality.
When do you think that would be ready to look at, Jonathan?
I suspect we could have something in the next, I don't want to commit to next month. We could have something next month, though I don't think it would be finalized, but honestly, I would say a couple of months.
Yeah, I think August sounds good. Also for the board to know that there's almost certainly going to be a next iteration of this climate discussion with you in the August meeting also, when we probably come back with that resolution we're going to take to council later in August. So maybe does August sound like a decent time, Jonathan, or just September?
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and tentatively plan for August? In the meantime, what I can do is forward on just a 2-pager, a little bit of a white paper that describes the project, and that might help ground some of the questions and thoughts that you might have leading into August.
Okay. So Mike, those were the two things I just want to make sure we had time to cover.
Yeah, do we have any other questions or comments from the group on this before we wrap?
I just wanted to answer the question about the standards for the consumption-based emissions. So we're currently working with ICLEI, walking through the process of how to create the consumption-based inventory. And we're using their US Community Protocol as kind of the framework for doing so. So it's kind of a newer field of emissions inventory, and there's not as much, I guess, standardization as there is for like a regular city inventory, but we are working with ICLEI in developing it and are using the best guidance that's out there right now.
So it should be comparable and compared to other places.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hernan, did you had a list of questions? Was there anything else that you want to throw on the table tonight?
Oop, I think you're muted, Hernan.
Sorry, yeah, I have a question, but I feel like they're more technical, so I don't know if it's a good fit for tonight. We can discuss them later. Yeah, I don't want to bore you.
Well, please, if you'd like, follow up with us over email or something so we can, if there's other things you wanted to go into detail.
I had one more from Marty. I would be happy to read into the record if that's okay with everyone.
Please.
So he says here, critical to stabilizing climate, a parenthetical, beneath thresholds of global temperature rise beyond 2 degrees C, half of which has already occurred, and parenthetical, is to create more greenhouse gas sinks. How can Boulder, in partnership with neighboring communities, promote new land use practices that accelerate the growth of such sinks, e.g. via reforestation? How can we coordinate with university or business sectors to create enterprise discovery hubs for technological solutions to capture and sequester carbon? And has that been considered in the plan? That's one for Marty.
Yeah, I want to just further elaborate on this because Marty had a chance to talk to me a little bit about this. It's very interesting. He calls out the natural climate sinks piece, which is very much a part of one of the things that we are focused on. We're building some tools around that. But he went further to say, is there a role for the city in trying to stimulate innovation around some of the technology-oriented approaches to carbon capture and removal? And so I think that's a really interesting question. Most local jurisdictions that I've been in discussion with around carbon drawdown have been talking exclusively about natural systems approaches, but there are a few places like Vancouver who've said, you know, there might be a role for us in being able to stimulate technology development or incubate or be a recipient of purchaser of equipment that can do that kind of thing. So I think that's an interesting idea that we have not yet discussed. But we have a very vibrant startup community, and maybe there are ways. I think this gets to something I think Susan was also referring to about the importance of active collaborations between the city and the university. And so, Jonathan, I think it might be an interesting topic to take up with the university around areas of technology and business development.
It seems like we're like well suited, like you said, Brett, to, you know, at the nexus of like the university and startups and, you know, a community will to support these things. And it might be a good place for it, or at least to initiate some of those things.
Yeah.
Well, I do have some input on that actually, because so I feel the money for those things is already there. Maybe what the city can do instead is partner with the labs or the university to reach the startups and let them know how to get that money. So for example, so I work for a federal lab in California, and they're part of the Department of Energy. So the Department of Energy has this call for proposals where an industry partner teams up with a national lab to do some high performance computing simulations to improve something related to energy. And the award is $300,000 for a year, which is not much in our field, but still. And it's hard for us as a national lab to get partners from industry. Like nobody is approaching us, so we have to go as the lab, kind of like, you know, ask these companies, is there something you want to improve? And it's like, it makes me think, you know, why hasn't any startup approached us? We have, I think we're gonna have next year the biggest supercomputer in the world in my lab, and you know, nobody is like, hey, you know, why don't we apply for this stuff? Like get free money. So maybe the money is already there. Maybe it'll be a matter of like, you know, trying to have the university or the labs here in Boulder do some seminars or something that, you know, let the startups know about all. I mean, this is not the only grant available. There's like grants all the time, like SBIRs, like small business innovation research grants from the Department of Defense. Like there's all sorts of money, like there's a lot of money out there. And yeah, just, you know, have the startups know about them and then just apply.
Yeah, it's really interesting you should mention this. In 2014, we did something called the Boulder Energy Challenge, where we took a little bit of our CAP money and we actually created a competitive grants program for startups. And several of them went on to actually having significant influence. So one of them, Lightning Hybrids, went on to be doing leading edge work around compression, transportation stuff. Another one actually was what was then called Snug Home is now called Radiant Labs, and they built energy modeling software, and they got a grant to do exactly that with NREL, where NREL did a bunch of computer modeling for them, which helped build out their product some more. So I'm just thinking with my colleagues here, we might want to think about a sort of Boulder Energy Challenge, you know, phase 2, where we might look at some of these other sectors that like CCR or others that need, and maybe we could partner with the labs to actually facilitate that kind of an offering. So I think great idea, Hernan.
Yeah, I mean, and Boulder doesn't even have to commit money. Like the NSF
Yeah.
is flooded with money. Like
Yeah.
the Department of Energy is like has money for this stuff already there, just waiting for somebody to apply and get it. And I think the startups will be in a good position because a lot of these larger companies, like we the lab had to approach like Boeing and Toyota and Ford, and to see if they wanted to collaborate. But since there's a lot of like trade secrets and a lot of regulations and stuff, it was hard for them, even if they wanted to be like, oh yeah, we're just we're gonna let you know what we're doing and let's collaborate. So startups will be in a better position because they don't have to deal with all that red tape yet. So yeah, I mean, if you can just point them in the right direction, as part of Boulder Challenge, either Boulder puts the money or use the money that's already there, that could be really beneficial.
Jonathan?
Yeah, thanks. I love this conversation, and I'm fearful of even opening my mouth because this could go on for another 45 minutes. No, Hernan, I really appreciate this architecture that you're starting to talk through, and it's something that we have been discussing for many, many years. In fact, unfortunately, it's been very acute where we do have these opportunities to work with the labs and the university and the private sector around a specific issue. I could point to handfuls of grants that we have participated in and projects that we have partnered with. In fact, just last week, my colleague Heidi Van Genderen, the Chief Sustainability Officer at CU, we work very closely with her and our colleagues at the university. We have a number of MOUs with the university. She and I co-presented at a Biden summit that was really around city-university collaboration. And what we were trying to bring out is we're missing other parts to that architecture, and it is the labs, and we are well positioned in Boulder with access to labs, and the other side, which is the private sector. How do you commercialize? How do you bring it to scale? And having all of those parts in that arc, I think, is incredibly powerful. So it's one of the areas that we are working on with our colleagues at the university. There is a strong desire to do that. It's a big, complex organization, no question, but we are getting closer to having something that's a little more formal instead of just, wow, here's an idea. Can we all scramble to pull it together at the last minute? So I just wanted to repeat back to you what a great idea it is. And we are trying to move on that. One of the biggest areas we're working on right now is thinking about transit and mobility and how we start looking at shared fleet services and things that we can do as big agencies that all have fleet applications. Can we do more together? Can we do some testing with the labs? Can we bring in the private sector to look at some really interesting strategies? So more to come on that. I just wanted to reference back that it's a great idea.
Thanks. So Brett, we have like, what, 18 minutes left or something, 16 minutes left. Do we want to end this discussion just to have a couple of minutes to focus a little more on air quality and the plague management plan, or do we want to continue this and for those, or how do you feel about it?
This has been really helpful for us, I think, in terms of feedback that will help us further refine our proposal or our presentation to council. So thank you all. And please don't feel like this is your last shot. In fact, if you have more comments, please send them in, in the next few days. And then again, we'll be back to you in August with another set of this part of this discussion. So I think I feel complete for tonight. Any last comments from any of my colleagues?
Just one, Brett. I think we want to honor our commitment to represent comments that the board has had on the memo, on the proposal. And so I just I think we need to gather up tomorrow morning and see if we can summarize what we've heard and find the best way to represent that to council, whether it be on a slide and just some high level points. And I would want to make sure that the board is comfortable with how your feedback is being represented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.
And Susan, again, I don't know how we both thank you and honor you for getting up so darn early in Greece. And I hope you can go out and take a dip in the ocean or whatever you need to do to be compensated for that. But thank you so much for making that effort.
Thanks, Susan.
Heck no, I'm going back to sleep. And it was my pleasure to be here. And I hope it's some indication of how important I think it is for Boulder and how important the work you are doing is. So thank you so much for your work on this.
Thank you, Susan.
Great. Thanks everyone else. And so Brett, we had next on there is, I don't know, Miriam, is there anything else we want to talk about on the air quality effort in the couple minutes we have left? It's just listed here as an item. I don't know if you have anything else you wanted to throw in.
And Mike, just know that there's at least one other parent in my colleague set tonight. So y'all, if you felt like you wanted to go take care of the family there, please feel free. And Lauren, also thank you for joining tonight.
Nice. Yeah, okay.
Go ahead.
Should I
Mary.
go ahead or do you want to go, Brett?
Oh, well, I can just really quickly report,
Okay.
owing again to Miriam's leadership. I really deeply appreciate that she keeps pushing us on this, because it isn't an area that the city has any sort of formal responsibilities or planning functions in yet. But we did meet, I guess it was last week, with the county, one of the county public health officials, to see specifically whether or not the county had any plans around how to position resources to support those who are most vulnerable to bad air quality events in the community. And
So can I jump in? I don't know if you saw my email, but there is additional steps being taken. There are additional steps being taken beyond that email exchange we had with that county representative. Did you
Great.
see that email?
I'm not sure I did, so please go ahead.
Okay. So there was a RAM messaging meeting subsequent to that exchange we had with Bill. And Bill is a monitoring guru, and he isn't really the equity contact for the county. And the county's equity contact is Christian Herman, and he is going to be very active in outreach from this group. He's actually spearheading some of the outreach efforts coming from this group of different communities about how, what is the best practices and how we're going to go about doing this. I still think it's going to take a great deal of effort from City of Boulder separately or in conjunction with what Christian is going to be working towards, but it's at least another contact with the county that I think that we can work with, hopefully in partnership, to move this forward.
Yeah, I look forward to talking to Christian about it, because I know Christian's primary role is in communications. And so I think that's great. And I think that finding ways to be more effective and doing best practices around communications is really important. But that's not the same as making sure that we are putting together resources and making them available to people who are at risk. And I'm not clear whether the county is planning to do that or not. And I think that that's what we need to figure out.
Well, I think that we should bring that to the discussion. I told you, or I said in the email I sent, that I volunteered to be part of the group with Christian, and I can bring that to the table in the discussions that we have with him.
Yeah, that'd be great. And
Okay.
So I'll make sure that I look at that email again and Jonathan, I guess just for you, I think that there's an open question about both what can be done and what role the county will play, if any, in trying to resource people to take action, or whether that's something that we need to try to take on entirely ourselves. And I just think we don't yet have clarity about that question. And we need it soon, because we don't have very much time before we could have another air quality event. So that's kind of the place where we stand. But again, thank you very much, Miriam, for all that you've done and continue to do.
Thanks, Miriam. Okay, so with a few minutes left, the last thing on the agenda was just a quick update on a memorandum on the plague management plan, which I think I can summarize pretty quickly as saying that the project website and informational video should be available by early June. And Brett, those aren't up yet. I haven't looked today, but not yet. Okay. So sometime in the next week or two, I'd imagine. And then it looks like in June, there'll also be a virtual public stakeholder meeting. And I don't know if we have a role in that or not, Brett, or the board.
Not directly, but it's certainly something that those who are interested can participate in.
Okay, And going forward from that, it looks like it'll go into development of a draft plan later in the summer with a final plan being reviewed in September and the final plan itself in December. So yeah.
And I apologize. I probably should have been clearer when we attached this. It's not, there's nothing to take action on, and there's even nothing to read yet. It's really more of a notice from OSMP that they are working on this, that there's going to be a process for engagement around it. And they were just sort of laying out that process.
Yep. Yeah. So that's it. And I think with that, we're
Can I just add one more thing? I didn't finish. Sorry. But I think I mentioned on the last meeting that we had that there will be a pilot availability of the dashboard that's being developed for the RAM monitoring. And so you'll be able to access at least the website and probably potentially a phone app through that. And the pilot is set to be starting up by the end of June.
cool. That's exciting.
Mike, I have just one more item for you regarding the Greenways Advisory Committee.
Yes.
And whether you are committed to serve on that committee again this year.
Sure. I'm happy to do it unless anyone else really wants to give it a shot, but I can do it.
Yeah, and Mike, I think there's gonna be a lot of action around the Greenways Committee this year. So there's some new staffing around that and some new energy around that. So I think it's gonna be a good year for Greenways engagement.
Yeah, I'd like to do it. Unless someone, like I said, unless someone else really wants to give it a shot, I'm happy to do it.
Unless somebody else really wants to add another meeting to their calendar.
Yeah.
Great, thank
Alright.
you.
Thanks.
There are no takers.
Okay, I'm in. Count me in.
And one more thing I want to say, are there any plans to start meetings in person? Are you like, I don't know, I'm fully vaccinated, so I'm kind of curious because of that.
There are no clear plans yet, as far as I know. Jonathan, do you have any updates around that?
No, all I will say is that council is right now considering going back to in-person meetings after their recess, and the idea of boards and commissions starting to meet in person has been discussed, but as Brett said, no decisions have been made.
When is the recess?
Their recess, I'm sorry, is end of June to mid-July. So they may go back by their second meeting in July. I think the city's overall plan is shooting for kind of all doors open philosophy by mid-September. So I would say maybe to target that time frame, at least to be safe.
Great. All right. With that, I think we can adjourn, and if there's nothing else, all set. Great.
Second adjournment. Yes.
All right. Take care. Thank you very much, Jonathan, and everyone else who came.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Everybody. Bye, Brett.
Bye.
Bye.